You never spend your whole life giving, only to realize people weren't grateful. They were just waiting for their chance to take more. I learned that lesson the night my son's wife told me, not asked me, told me, that my beach house, the one I worked half my life to build, was theirs now. She smiled when she said it, like the matter was already settled. But she forgot something. I may be soft, I may be quiet, but I am not weak. And I don't break. Not anymore. So when they showed up with suitcases at my doorstep, I made sure the one thing that went crashing down was their entire world. They said it as if they were naming a color. Casual, bright, not even a question. "We'll stay at the beach house while our place is being fixed," Marissa announced, her smile calibrated for the moment, like a woman used to getting what she wanted because she asked in the right tone. Her father laughed. Her mother nodded and reached for my hand as if they were all sharing a private joke I'd been invited to as an afterthought. My son stared at his plate and picked at the edge of it with a fork until the tines left tiny crescents of metal against china. No one asked me. No one paused to see if my face tightened, or to remember that the house they talked about like a Saturday plan had been my refuge for 30 years, the prize of my life's small victories. When you spend decades being the one who holds things together, you learn to smile and smooth edges. It's easier sometimes than asking for credit, easier than reminding the people you love that you are still a person with edges. Smiled. He nodded. I raised my glass when they toasted and pretended to be the agreeable woman I had been trained to be. Quiet, accommodating, grateful. Inside, something that had been dulled for years started to hum awake. Not rage at first. Not yet. A steady, insistent clarity like a tide finding the right channel. The beach house was not a linen closet or an old photograph. It was the place where I taught myself to sand a door frame and seal a leak when the roof began to fail. It was the place where I learned that if you put in an hour more at night after work, the paint would hold a little longer and the home would keep its warmth. It smelled of resin and sunscreen and the particular kind of salt air that cleanses a person's edges. I had watched the house change from a fledgling weekend place to the quiet center of my later life. It was the one place I had made for myself, without anyone telling me it was unseemly or inconvenient. They could not simply speak of it as if it were a thing to be borrowed the way you borrow a casserole dish. That night, I lay awake listening to the ocean, thinking of the way Marissa had folded her hands and promised to take good care, as if that erased the years of my labor. The moonlight skimmed the edge of my kitchen table, where a yellow legal pad waited like an old companion, and I thought of paper. Paper keeps track. Paper remembers. If memory can be forced into ink, you can hold the world to account. The plan began quietly, the way good plans must. First, I called contractors and asked for estimates. I asked questions a little too fast, as if the urgency of the phone call had put paint on the dial tone. How long for the permits? Can you start within a week? Will you need additional subcontractors? Show me the timeline. I scheduled a locksmith to come out. I called a security company and asked about monitored systems and cameras. Then I called Jenna, a lawyer I'd found after a slow afternoon of researching in a public library, a woman who said in a single sentence what others had never said to me. You have the right to make rules for how your property is used. You have the right to be the one who decides. I have always been deliberate, though people rarely notice the small calculations that keep a life together. For years I paid bills on time and tucked cash into a safety envelope labeled house. I forewent nice dinners and new coats. I learned how to fix smoke alarms, how to cook a forkful of leftovers and turn them into something a person might still enjoy. My life wasn't a parade. It was the work of many small sacrifices stacked into a modest home that belonged to me. It was mine because I had paid day by day, with time and patience and elbow grease. Now, in the waning light of my years, I saw that I could either speak up or watch the family who had learned to take without asking take something else because it was easiest for them to assume I would not object. I began to assemble the evidence. Contracts signed, deposit receipts, permit applications, everything with a date and a name. I had the contractor texted photos of the initial walk through that morning. The warped deck boards, the leaky gutter, the corner where the paint bubbled like old scabbed skin. I had an email chain with the locksmith confirming the locks and make, model numbers, and the estimated install time. I had the security company's quote and a promise that their systems could be live and monitored in 48 hours. I had Jenna draft a living trust and a notice for the county recorder that listed the property as temporarily closed for renovation and secured, with specific dates and contact information. The documents felt like armor. I took them to a notary and watched a stern man print his stamp on a page and feel my mouth form small, secret smiles. I knew the law didn't hum and shout like a person. The law is slow and methodical. It doesn't rescue you with flair. It rescues you with paperwork. And if you care for that paperwork, it is hard for people to steal what doesn't appear in their neighborhood of assumptions. When I told Tom what I was doing, he shifted like someone waking from a half-sleep. He is the soft sort, the man who likes his coffee weak and his shirts ironed. He has always wanted to keep everyone comfortable, a trait that made him kind but vulnerable when a sharper voice took the lead. "Ma," he said, in a voice that carried a tremor of apology before the words even caught up, "do you have to make it all so complicated?" "Yes," I said, "because it needs to be done right." It hurt to hear him call my insistence complication. But in his face I saw a truth that had been dull as a stone for years. He had been willing to let me slide out of the center of my own story to keep his peace. He had never woken up to the idea that his silence cost me things. Now that he had seen the edges, that soft voice found small apologies. "I'll help," he promised. He meant it and he tried to. He tried in little ways for the next weeks, answering contractor texts, picking up paint samples, taking off a trim piece and handing me the nails. His hands clumsy but earnest. I accepted his effort gratefully and noted, without gloating, that kindness after the fact does not erase years of absence. It is the beginning of a new habit, not the proof of repentance. While I assembled my papers, Marissa told people the way people tell one another a plan they have no reason to fear. She posted a photo of the children in a cardboard fort with a caption, "Beach Week, here we come," as if the house were an empty stage waiting for them to arrive. She tagged friends and ordered inflatable pool floats. She made lists of paint colors and began to speak of the house in terms of aesthetic decisions. Cushions, shades, picture frames. It was sickly in a way, like watching someone decorate a museum of memory without asking the artist. I let the posts scroll across my feed and did not respond. I was patient because patience is a craft. I learned the best revenge is like knitting. Patience stitches the pattern until the design is complete. And I wanted this pattern to be visible and undeniable. The morning they came to move in, the sky was the silver of a cheap photograph. Marissa's car pulled into my drive with the air of entitlement she wore like perfume. The moving truck that followed was louder than the sea. I stood on the porch under a sky that had never seemed friendlier when it simply did the weather and nothing else. I watched as Marissa stepped out in a new blouse and sunglasses and set her hand on the moving company door like it was an extension of her will. Tom carried a small box, his head bowed, as if to gather the courage for an apology that had been preempted by the thrill of ownership. They walked up my steps with the confidence of people who had decided the world bends to their calendar. The movers opened the back and two men stepped to the ramp, their knees cracking with the rhythm of manual labor. The porch camera, installed the day after I signed the trust and paid the deposit, watched them like a curious bird. I had set the system to record stills and motion, and to send a notification if any person lingered to manipulate the lock set. I sat inside with my phone on a small table, watching the live feed. The images were grainy, domestic, the kind that make a neighbor check the unfolding scene with casual curiosity. Little boxes, a child with a sticker, the sun catching on a silver hairpin. Marissa walked to the door and pressed the knob. It did not turn. She pressed again. She frowned and squeezed the knob so tight her knuckles whitened. She laughed, the sounds like a woman tripping over the edge of her confidence. "It must be jammed," she called to Tom, loud enough that someone on the street might think this was a neighborhood inconvenience. My security system had a recorded message ready. Professional and calm. This property is temporarily secured under renovation. No entry is authorized. Please leave the premises or you will be subject to trespass enforcement. The voice was not mine. It was neutral. Legal. Marissa stopped, a little indignant, and looked around for witnesses, for proof that this was a mistake that could be corrected with a smile. The movers looked at each other, awkward and unsure. The kids rummaged through a box, oblivious to the undertow building. Tom called out from the truck, "Ma, it's us. Please." His voice broke on that please. He wanted permission, a way to avoid the awkwardness his wife had formed into a narrative of entitlement. He wanted to be absolved without ever having to say he had been wrong. He wanted me to be the one who made everything easy again. I stayed quiet. Jenna had been clear. Let them make the initial action. Let the trespass be visible. It sounds strange, I know, to set a trap where the law steps in. Sounds like violence. But sometimes the only faithful way to protect yourself is to allow a system to do what systems do. Measure, count, record. The law is not a sword, unless someone hands you all the facts. I had the facts. When the officers arrived, they were polite and flat in the way people with experience must be. They listened to calm recitations of dates and when asked, I handed over the proofs. Contracts showing the contractor's arrival 2 days earlier, the deposit receipts, the notice to the county recorder. Each paper was a small bell that rang with a truth. The house was not abandoned for the sake of convenience. It was closed legally for renovation. The officers read the trust documents and looked at Tom in a way his father had never taught him to see. Husbands, wives, sons. These were not their considerations. Their concern was the law. Marissa's face turned from a smug shine to a public flush. She argued in the florid, entitled way of someone who had never learned to lose gracefully. It's just a few things, she said, voice rising. We were only going to stay for a week. It's not like. She gestured to the sky as if the sea itself should act as an accomplice. The officer asked if she had explicit written consent from the property owner. She flipped through her phone as if a deed might appear within the glow of the screen. There was nothing. The moving company backed up, their insurance forms suddenly in the fore of their minds. The neighbors watched with the small, private joy of witnesses who had an explanation for the drama of the day. When the officers concluded what the papers already concluded, Marissa tried a different tactic. Shame. How could you do this to us? She asked me, wounded for show. We would have taken care of everything. You hate change. You took care of everything by assuming permission, I said, my voice steady, the way you steady a ladder when someone needs to climb. If you wanted to use the house, all you had to do was ask me to approve it in writing. That was the agreement I made with myself and with the county. Tom's face was the color of wet paper. He reached for me in a way that was not yet courage but was the start of it. Ma, he began and then stopped as if the apology could be a thing to be transferred in small bills. He had wanted to avoid confronting his own part in the silence by assuming I would always forgive. That assumption had been a luxury he wore without considering the debts he accrued. Now, looking at me with a small, honest grief, he said, "I'm sorry." It was the kind of apology that is the first brick laid toward repair. It was sincere. It did not undo what had happened, but it was not worthless. I could have wept at the sight of him, because the sadness in a child's eyes will always pull the older person's heart like a tide. But the house was larger than a single tear. The house was proof that I must keep what I had built intact. I accepted his apology, but I did not change the facts. The law had already begun to shape. The public humiliation that followed was not something I reveled in. I regretted the pain they felt, even as I knew the lesson had to be learned. Marissa's posts went quiet. The tagged friends that had laughed with her at brunch filtered messages in their inboxes. Some offered sympathy, some tested the curiosity of gossip. The moving company called her with apologies about insurance liabilities and the possibility of fines. Her pride did not collapse in a courthouse. It faltered on social platforms and in casual neighborhood conversations. She tried to present the narrative she preferred, but the hard paper I had laid in front of the world, a testimony of premeditated renovation and closed occupancy, made her narrative look like a child's attempt to retell a game they had not read the rules to. People will say that taking the law to a family dispute is cold and unnecessary. I heard them in the weeks later. They asked neighbors why an old woman with a gentle face would ruffle feathers and turn to the county recorder. I would have shrugged if it had been about show. But it was about memory. I was refusing to accept being used anymore, and the law was simply the instrument I had chosen because it spoke in terms that the world would honor. Dates, signatures, and public notice. It was not cruelty. It was limitation. After the weekend, when the contractors left for the day, I sat with Tom on the porch. We watched the light move over the surf and felt the sort of silence that is no longer empty but full of possible conversation. He took my hand, and it was clumsy and warm. "Ma," he said, I didn't know you'd feel so." The words trailed off. He was ashamed by how long it had taken him to realize that silence could be theft. He had learned to prioritize ease over taking responsibility. His apology was the first evidence he was starting to rewrite his habits. He helped in small ways after that. He painted a threshold strip I could not bend down to one afternoon, fetched screws we needed for a loose banister, and made a pot of coffee and set it beside my sketchbook. He did not attempt to take control again. He listened, and in listening he apologized in a way that mattered, through altered and consistent behavior. That mattered to me because ruinous patterns tend to repeat until someone learns to break the habit. If he changed, it would be because he decided, not because I forgave him. Marissa's public figure, so curated and gleaming, started to have weak spots. People whispered about the incident at neighborhood gatherings. About entitlement and about the audacity of assuming. She tried to force a narrative of reconciliation online. Photos of herself with flowers, sickly captions about family love. But the story had already been rewritten in a place she could not afford to rewrite: the county records and the police report. When the moving company left a terse review about the incident on the community page, some readers speculated, others scolded. None of these ripples mattered to me. The ripples mattered to her. Her social water turned choppy and she was unsettled. The second act of my plan was not theatrical. It was about taking advantage of the window that my legal measures had opened. While everyone expected things to be the same, I would change the checks and balances that determined what the property meant in the family's world. I revisited Jenna and asked for tighter language in the trust, and for records that would make any attempt to claim implied permission impossible without explicit written and notarized consent. We added a clause that stated, in no uncertain terms, that any person who attempted unauthorized entry would forfeit any presumption of implied occupancy or inheritance claims emanating from that event. We attached photos, logs, and the contractor's timeline as a schedule to the trust. In layman's terms, it was a brick wall dressed up as legalese. Legal documents can sound like dry, impenetrable things when you read them in a library. But when you stitch a family history into a trust, when you provide dates and signatures and recorded intentions, you transform a private act into public evidence. I wanted the record to show that for years I had been making decisions for myself and that when they attempted to take, I had not been passive. Documentation does more than stop a moving truck. It deters assumptions and forces people to face the parts of themselves they prefer to ignore. Weeks became months. The renovation progressed. A new heater that hummed politely, shingled roof that sat like a soft cap over the house, floors sanded until they reflected light back like a memory. It was work that cost money and time and reasoned attention. I paid for every bit of it because paying was what I had always done. Exchange and care. I was not trying to punish so much as insulate. The public unraveling came gradually and then all at once. An old friend I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who admired my garden and had once invited me to be part of a charity bake sale, reached out. She had read my side of the story through a conversation that wound itself into the right ears. She offered to host a small community meeting focused on coastal preservation, a cause I had quietly supported for years. Accepted. It gave me a venue to speak about something that mattered to me beyond the confinement of family drama. At the community meeting, I talked about beaches and tides and how families pass on values across generations. I said nothing directly about entitlement, but I spoke about stewardship and responsibility and the quiet work that goes into caring for a place. People listened. They nodded. Afterwards, a neighbor told me, with the sort of sincerity that unpacks a person, "We didn't know what you did for this neighborhood. We didn't know how much you put in." She squeezed my hand, and something warm passed between us. Recognition. Marissa watched these gestures and misread them as a shrinking of her narrative. She tried to assert a counterstory online. She posted a sunset with a caption about family upheaval and resilience. People responded, some with sympathy and some with skepticism. She tried to reclaim public sentiment, but the trust documents were a stronger narrative than any curated post. The law is not an argument to be moderated. It is a record the world can access. Tom, for his part, began to show up in ways I hadn't expected. He volunteered at the community event, helping set out chairs and handing out flyers, his hands stained with coffee and paint. Once, as we were washing the folding chairs together, he said in a quiet voice, "I was scared of standing up once. I thought if I spoke, I'd ruin everything. But staying quiet felt worse." He had learned finally that silence is a kind of theft. Months after the initial attempt, Marissa staged a public reclamation. A small meet and greet at a cafe where she intended to speak about family values and forgiven.